Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Privacy Watch Series webinar, Cracking the Code of Age-Appropriate Design Laws. We're going to give another minute or so here for everyone to get into the session. But as we do that, a couple points of quick housekeeping. First off, if you have any questions during today's webinar, be sure to put them in the Q&A box. We'll be monitoring that during the session, and if there are any we can't get to, we'll follow up afterwards. We did receive a couple before the session that we'll address during the session. Secondly, these sessions are recorded and will be made available on our website probably sometime next week. So if you are, I don't know, needing to leave early or you want to share it with a colleague, then definitely check out our website, mslawgroup.com, for that recording. And kind of on the same theme, if you're interested in getting additional content, blogs, webinar invites, and so forth, you can always subscribe on our website, mslawgroup.com/subscribe. So with that, let me introduce myself. I'm Josh Stevens, a partner here at McMurray & Schuster. My practice focuses primarily on privacy, data security, telemarketing, and marketing and advertising compliance. I'm joined here today by my colleague, Aaron. Aaron, say hi.
My name's Aaron Parry. I'm an associate at McMurray & Schuster. I'm in the compliance practice group. Also spend a little time with our litigation team, but as like Josh, I focus in data privacy, telemarketing, and advertising compliance.
And as we kick off today's webinar, a legal webinar wouldn't be the same without a disclaimer. Just to remind everyone, this is an educational session. We're not providing legal advice. Everybody's factual circumstances are different, and especially in the area of privacy, little factual nuances can really change how these laws apply to you. So definitely, if you want to act on any of the things that we talk about today, talk to your attorney first. Hopefully that's us. But if not, definitely consult the attorney you're using. All right, well, let's get started. As you saw from the title of today's session, we're really focusing on children's privacy and some landmark developments that are occurring in that space. And today's session is going to follow a certain theme. The first part is we're going to look at where the law kind of stands today. Then we're going to look at these new laws that have passed in California and Connecticut and what they require. And then we're going to wrap the session by looking into the future and seeing what's potentially on the horizon for businesses. And the reason that we wanted to do this webinar is because the way that these laws are developing, they're likely to impact a lot more businesses than the laws that are currently in place. And the first of those laws I want to talk about is the Children's Online Privacy Act, also referred to as COPPA. This law was passed originally in 1998. It's been around for quite a while, and it applies to operators of websites or online services that target children under the age of 13 or who knowingly collect personal information online from users under 13. And most of our clients don't target people under 13. And a lot of them take active steps to try not to collect the personal information of people under 13. But that, that may have saved them for a while, but as we're going to talk about, the landscape is changing. COPPA has been something that websites that target children have struggled with ever since it was passed because it is very strict in what it requires. It has notice requirements about how you're collecting information, how you're using it, how you're disclosing it. It requires verifiable parental consent before you can collect, use, and disclose personal information of children. This has tripped up a lot of businesses on how do you actually get that consent. It gives parents rights with regard to that data, and it also requires that a child be able to use the services without giving up more personal information than is reasonably necessary for the online service. So it's pretty strict in the parameters it sets around the use of online services by children. And of course, it has data security requirements because all of these do. Now, in 2020, the California Consumer Privacy Act expanded the world of children's privacy regulation. It's similar to COPPA for individuals under 13. So particularly this relates to online services. I guess the better way to say it would be that what the CCPA did was it basically adopted COPPA into it, and then it added some additional nuance when you're dealing in the context of sales and sharing. So for example, for children under 13, the business has to use reasonable means to determine if the person consenting, and notice consenting, so consent being required, to the sale or sharing of personal information from someone under 13, or a person making a privacy request related to that information is actually the parent. And this is kind of like the verifiable parental consent concept from COPPA. That's a tough thing to do. The regulations give some examples, but to give you a sense, some of them are like operate a toll-free hotline that's staffed by trained persons who can verify that it's a parent, have a video conference with the parent, get a signed consent from the parent under penalty of perjury, use the parent's government ID to verify their identity. So really high bars for what it means to verify that the person who's giving that consent or making that request is indeed the parent. It also required that when consent is given, there has to be a notice about how to opt out of the sale or sharing of personal information. So this is an additional notice beyond just giving a privacy policy. Now, one of the really interesting things about CCPA is it then went on to say, well, we know essentially that COPPA draws this hard line for people who are under 13 and people who are 13 and older. And it basically assumes that people who are 13 or older are adults and can act like adults. And I think we all know, whether from our children, grandchildren, nieces, nephews, or just our own lives, that 13 to 18-year-olds maybe not quite ready to act like adults. So COPPA sets a standard for 13 to 15-year-olds where, for the most part, they're treated like adults. But when it comes to the sale and sharing of their personal information, they have to affirmatively opt into that as opposed to just having the opt-out right that CCPA normally requires. And they're entitled to this extra notice of how they can later opt out if they choose to do so. Now, California wasn't the only state that's passed comprehensive consumer privacy laws in the last couple of years that have shaken up the world. Others that are currently in effect include Colorado, Virginia, Connecticut, Utah. There are many more on the horizon. But for the most part, those laws have followed the COPPA model and are treating 13 and older as essentially adults. Now, we're going to talk about Connecticut in a second because, as I mentioned at the top of the hour, that's one of the two states that have passed some really interesting comprehensive age design laws. But the Colorado-Virginia model, as I said, if you're a business that's really working with people 13 and older, doesn't usually change too much about what you're doing. So as I mentioned, California and Colorado, or Connecticut rather, have passed some really interesting age-appropriate design laws that are going to have a huge impact. And I'm going to turn it over to Aaron to walk us through what those laws require.
So there's been a growing recognition that children can be harmed online. I think these laws are developed to protect children's health and well-being. We know that children are especially vulnerable to online risks because they kind of lack the experience and the critical thinking skills required to mitigate online harms. So states have begun to enact these design code laws, which require enhanced privacy protections for children and more transparency measures. These laws have different form, different requirements. In this session, we'll only review the child design laws that have broad applicability, but there are also several states that have specific laws directed mostly to social media platforms Those types of laws require social media platforms, for example, to obtain parental consent for children under 18 and to verify the age of users. Some of those concepts we'll see are in these more broadly applicable design code laws. So applicability, the California Age Appropriate Design Code Act applies to entities that meet the CPRA's business definition. You can see on the screen here the thresholds for those businesses, and that provides an online product, service, or feature that's likely to be accessed by children. What likely to be accessed by children means we'll get into soon. A quick note with the California law, it has been enjoined currently because there is the trade group Net Choice had lodged an allegation that the law violates the First Amendment. It's a kind of an unconstitutional content-based censor of speech, and it essentially gives the California Attorney General power to restrict any speech that it determines is not in the best interest of the child. Interestingly, some large organizations like the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the ACLU, the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, which includes the New York Times and AP, have filed amicus briefs in support of Net Choice's attack on this law. So right now, it's worthy to note that the law has been enjoined from enforcement. It's in appeal right now, so we'll continue to monitor the progress of that. On the flip side, Connecticut's law is effective later this fall, October 1st, and it applies to any person or entity that alone or jointly with others determines the purpose and means of processing personal information, and it offers any online service, product, or feature to consumers with whom such controller has actual knowledge or willfully disregards are minors. So kind of a little bit of a different applicability standard here. Moving on to our key definitions. So as Josh had mentioned, COPPA kind of stops right at the 13 mark. The FTC has concluded several different times that children 13 to 18 are not covered by COPPA. And according to the FTC, those teens are more likely to falsify or lie about their ages in online activities. And it just seems because of that, there is less need to require this verifiable parental consent. So online product or service or feature, that's just any service, product, or feature that's offered online, kind of simple there. The likely to be accessed by children definition is kind of interesting, and is the combination of multiple factors to determine whether your online service is likely to be accessed by children. And just a reminder that this standard is only in the California law, not in the Connecticut law. So as you can see here, the law lists several of those factors that you can use to determine if your service is likely to be accessed by children. A lot of these borrow from COPPA. And as a matter of fact, the first factor or indicator is whether the service is directed to children as defined by COPPA. And COPPA has its own list, as I mentioned, several which overlap with the list here. So moving along, these next few slides are going to be key concepts in both of the privacy laws, and then we'll kind of break down each law's specific obligations. So the new child laws here impose many privacy by design principles. They require businesses to respect child privacy and embed privacy into the design and infrastructure of systems and business practices, really from the beginning of development through the life cycle of the service, product, or feature. These necessity, use, and duration requirements that you see on this slide here are common privacy by design requirements and are common in our state comprehensive privacy laws as well. Necessity, the personal information must be necessary to provide the service. Use, you may only use it to provide the service, no secondary use. Duration, only keep it as long as reasonably necessary. Another common component of both of the bills are the requirement to conduct data protection assessments. And these are necessary under the California law for any time you're offering a service that may likely be accessed by children. In Connecticut, the data protection assessments are required when the online service is offered to consumers, whether offered before or after the effective date. So there's an implication there that you will want to go back in time to kind of run through the data protection assessment to identify the risks and make a plan to mitigate the risks. So the contents of the data protection assessments required under these laws can vary, but generally include what's the purpose for collecting the information, what's our use for this information, what's the purpose for providing the online service. The review of these data protection assessments have to be done anytime that there's a material change in the processing operations and at any cost biannually. You also have to retain records of your data protection assessments. And this is for the longer of the 3-year period beginning on the date on which the processing operations cease, or so long as the controller offers the online service. So part of the review of the data protection assessment includes this risk mitigation plan concept, where you have to implement a plan to eliminate or mitigate the risks that you've identified in your data protection assessment. And in California, that applies to risks that that have a material detriment on the child, or in Colorado to risks that present a heightened risk of harm. And thinking what those two different terms might mean, any unfair or deceptive treatment, unlawful impact on minors, any financial, physical, or reputational injury, or any physical or other intrusion upon the solitude or seclusion or private affairs of the minor. At the end here, you'll see a single data protection assessment can work as long as it addresses a comparable set of processing operations. And if you're conducting an assessment for compliance with another law that is reasonably similar in scope and effect, you will be deemed in compliance with these two laws.
Yeah, and Aaron, I think that's a really interesting point, because these data protection assessments are required under some of the, as you mentioned, the comprehensive state privacy laws, even when not dealing with children's data. There are certain types of processing that can trigger the need for these, like the sale of data, or processing for targeted advertising, or processing sensitive personal information, things that carry essentially a heightened risk of harm. And in fact, what we're seeing is in a lot of the new privacy laws that are coming into effect this year, next year, DPAs as a concept are throughout them. It's definitely something that regulators want businesses to do. They want businesses to sit down, take the time to think through, what are we doing? Why are we doing it? What's the risk to the consumer from this, and how do we mitigate that risk? So it's nice to see that that these children's age appropriate design acts recognize that you might be doing these assessments for another framework, so you don't need to necessarily repeat and do them again just for the act if you're covering the same type of stuff that would need to be covered from the act in an assessment you're doing for another state law.
Yeah, and great point, because these data protection assessments can get pretty long and complex depending on the processing activity. So it was a gracious give by the legislature.
Yeah.
So moving on to precise geolocation information, in both of the new child laws, they prohibit precise geolocation collection unless it's either strictly necessary in California or reasonably necessary in Connecticut to provide the online service. And you'll see the radius there differs enough that you'll just want to be cautious when you're implementing your compliance plans here. Also is this concept that the controller must provide to the minor a signal indicating the collection of geolocation data, and it has to be available for the entire duration of collection. So moving into the specifics of the California law, the first kind of major point is that controllers have to consider the best interest of the child when designing, developing, and providing an online service. That begs the question, what is the best interest of the child? It's not defined in the law, but we can look to other sources. The UN's Convention on the Rights of Child, it's an international human rights treaty that established some indication of what the best interest of the child is, and that's supporting the child's needs for safety, health, well-being, supporting their physical, psychological, and emotional development, supporting their freedom to associate and freedom of speech. So it's kind of a small phrase that carries a lot of meaning. Definitely something that's going to take time and consideration to reflect to really ensure that you are considering those things: the health, safety, well-being. And if a conflict arises between the best interest of the child and a commercial interest or need, the best interest of the child has to be prioritized under the California law. The California law also has a requirement that controllers estimate the age of child users with a reasonable level of certainty appropriate to the risks that arise from the data management practices. Or you have to apply the privacy protections to all consumers, even if they're not a child. So estimating age, internet service providers and some technology makers already have solutions available to block age inappropriate content, but this requirement really is kind of a substantial leap forward. This may require businesses to use multiple different technologies or factors. We've got to be thinking of the age a user gives, the user generated requests. What's the user on the website for? Where are they going? What are they posting about? And there's AI technologies, there's age gate technologies that will help with this, but it's kind of a important concept here that may take some thought to implement. Next is the default privacy settings configuration, where you have to configure all privacy settings to the highest level of privacy unless there's some compelling reason in the best interest of the child not to do so.
Yeah, and I do want to be clear on that one, that that's when you're interacting with a child user. So unless, to Aaron's point, on the estimating age, you can't estimate the age, and therefore you have to go to the, well, we're going to set our privacy settings for all consumers at the highest level. So it's not necessarily that you have to set your default privacy settings to the highest level across the board, but you do have to be very careful to determine, going back to estimating age, are we dealing with children or are we dealing with adults?
Right, right. And then just one other good consideration here is that the California law expressly states that you cannot use personal information for estimating age for any other purpose or retain it for longer than necessary to estimate age, and it must be proportionate to the risks and data practices for the online service. So our I think personal favorite here is the privacy information suited to children. This requirement ensures that all privacy information is disclosed in a way that's suited for a child to understand, and that would include your terms of service, privacy policy, standards, any privacy illustrations have to be easily understandable by children, which, you know, when you really think about it, it seems, like a easy requirement to meet when you're just talking through it like we are here. But when you really think through it, it might take a little bit longer to implement than one might think.
Yeah, so we actually have a little show and tell here. This is a video from Lego, and for those of you who don't know, I'm a big Lego fan. There's a rocket ship over the corner in there, if you notice. But they have a play website that is targeted to children, and so they developed a video to explain privacy concepts to children, and we think this is a really good example. And this is targeted to younger children. Of how you might go about explaining information based on the audience. And you might want to turn your speakers down a little bit. I think this video, if I remember correctly, is a little loud. So let's cue it up.
Meet Captain Safety. He's going to show us a little bit about Lego.com Kids Safety Policy. So when you move around Lego.com Kids, you leave little footprints, which help us to get to know you so we can show you things next time that we think you will find fun and interesting in the right language for you too. Now, we keep your footprints very safe and never show them to anyone else. We may also ask for your age or other details on Lego.com Kids, which help us give you a great experience. But we will never ask to use your real name when you're visiting us. We want to make sure that your real information stays private. And it's rather fun to make up your own name, isn't it? You might have also heard about cookies. These help us to remember all your details, so when you log in here, you can get on with liking, commenting, tracking your game scores, and stuff like that. This is all information we keep very safe because we take your privacy very seriously indeed, just like the captain. You can always find out what it is exactly that we know about you and your footprints and your cookies and tell us to change it or delete it. So if you want to know more about any of these things, you should talk to your parents and could even watch this video again with them. Right, Captain? Well, that's all from the captain for now, so remember to stay safe and have fun.
So as you can see there, this really, is targeted to a younger audience. If you are a business who might fall into these age-appropriate laws because you might have like 16 or 17-year-olds on your site, that may necessitate a different approach or one that looks more like adults. Maybe it's a version of the privacy policy that's just written in a more user-friendly way or something like that. as opposed to, say, you're dealing with people who are 13 or 14, maybe you need to look at some video content or interactive content like what we just saw.
There's some moving along here with other unique requirements under the California law. It does require that controllers provide privacy tools that help children exercise privacy rights and report privacy concerns. Similar to our last topic, the privacy information suited to children. These tools should be easy to use, accessible, prominent, just to ensure that children can use and access and use them. Also, you have to provide a obvious monitoring or tracking system when the child is being monitored or tracked, if the online service allows any person really to monitor the online activity of the child or to track the child's location. And lastly, the profile by default restriction essentially prohibits profiling a child by default unless the business can demonstrate that there's appropriate safeguards in place to protect children, and either the profiling is necessary to provide the online service, and the child has knowingly engaged the profiling, or there's a demonstrated compelling reason that's in the best interest of the child. So switching over to the specific requirements in the Connecticut law, they have a reasonable care standard. So it requires that controllers use reasonable care to avoid any heightened risk of harm to minors caused by the online service. We kind of hit on that a little earlier. The heightened risk of harm would include unfair, deceptive treatment, financial, physical, or reputational injury. In terms of system design, a controller cannot use any system design feature to significantly increase, sustain, or extend a minor's use of the online service. And this is a concept that's picking up traction, as I kind of hinted at when I introed into this part of the presentation. Children are spending a great deal of time online now, especially now more than ever, given that a lot of education has moved to online platforms. There's a lot of fun things like Legos, just a lot of reasons that children have to spend more time online. So this requirement ensures that we're not designing any feature to increase that time more than the child is already putting in online. A unique requirement also is the direct messaging prohibition. You can't use a direct messaging apparatus without providing readily accessible and easy to use safeguards to limit the ability of adults to send inappropriate content or unsolicited communications from folks that the minor's not connected with. There's also processor contract requirements, and these mirror Connecticut's comprehensive privacy law. If you're familiar with those, that's you have to adhere to the controller's instruction. You have to assist the controller with privacy obligations, and there has to be a contract governing the relationship in place. Uniquely, Connecticut's law has a consent requirement. You have to have the minor's consent or parental consent if the minor is 13 or less than 13 years of age. Remember that these laws apply to a child defined as anyone under 18. So between 18 or 13 and 18, we need the minor's consent, 13 and younger, parental consent. And that's for purposes of targeting, advertising, selling personal data, or profiling in furtherance of decisions that produce legal or similarly significant effects. And luckily here, where controller would be deemed in compliance if complying with the verifiable parental consent requirements under COPPA. In terms of enforcement of these laws, there is no private right of action. So good news there. In California, the penalties can range from $2,500 to $7,500, depending on whether it's an intentional or negligent violation. There is a limited right to cure, but you have to be in substantial compliance with the data protection assessment requirements, and if so, the California Attorney General would provide a notice to correct those areas where you haven't complied with. In Connecticut, the penalties constitute, or violation of the law constitutes an unfair, deceptive practice, which may result in a penalty of up to $25,000 per violation. There is a right to cure, but that right to cure sunsets beginning in 2026. So you only have about a little under a year and a half to take advantage of the right to cure before it switches to a conditional right to cure, where the Attorney General may grant that right to cure depending on a variety of factors. So more subjective to the Attorney General after 2026.
Yeah, and I think this might be a good spot to address one of the questions that we received before the session today, which relates to the liability of a graphic design or other type of marketing vendor that may help design a website or design content that is approved by the business, if that content or website is later found to violate one of these laws. And so I think I can maybe put some minds at ease that these laws really target the data controller, the business, right? So if I'm a graphic designer and I put together some content for a website for ABC Company, it's ABC Company that the regulator is going to go after. Now, that is not to say that ABC Company may not have a contractual indemnification right or some other way that they can turn around to me as the graphic designer and say, well, you took on the risk of this and we need you to indemnify us. But that would be as a result of the contractual relationship between the graphic designer and the business, not a direct violation or a direct enforcement action between the Attorney General's office and the graphic designer. So I think vendors can breathe a little bit there, but definitely have to look at their contracts. So as you see, Aaron's really pointed out that there is a trend now starting to emerge of concern around children and their online use, and what is that going to what unique risks does all the time that children spend online create? And so we are seeing a lot of legislation percolating up on this issue, and we're going to start at the state level. Run through a few bills here. These are ones that have been proposed in this legislative session, but have not yet passed as of when we put this together several days ago. So possible. Maybe one snuck through, but I highly doubt it in that short time frame. First is in California. So California is entertaining a bill to actually amend the CCPA to require consent from minors who are 13 or older in order to use and disclose personal information. So this would be a broader consent obligation than just sale or sharing of that personal information. And remember that sharing, when Aaron and I use that word, we're using it in terms of how it's defined in the California law, which is sharing for cross-context behavioral advertising purposes. So it's a little different and a narrower view of sharing than just the plain English definition of sharing. Colorado also entertaining a bill to amend its privacy law to raise that consent standard. So in order to collect and process personal information of people under 18, you'd have to have consent, and then it would also impose some other heightened protections. Hawaii and Maryland have multiple bills in play right now that are similar to the California and Connecticut bills that we just talked through, and would provide similar obligations and rights. And one of those obligations that I think we really need to keep in mind is this concept of acting in the best interest of the child from California, or acting in a way that doesn't cause a heightened risk of harm to the child under Connecticut's law. Because businesses have traditionally, even when dealing with teenagers, prioritized commercial interests and haven't really weighed, well, what is the risk here? What is the potential harm that could come to these children? And now they're having an obligation to do that. If more states come online, you're going to see that obligation spread. And at some point, I think a business is going to have to just make a decision that this is just part of our privacy by design process. This is just the way that we view things. We're not doing it just because a state says we have to. We're doing it because it's the right thing to do. So we'll see if we get to that tipping point. But turning back to these state bills, Virginia, as you see here, has 4 bills just itself in play. All have slight differences, but essentially similar to California and Colorado's bills, looking to amend Virginia's comprehensive privacy law to require consent to process the PI of minors. One of these bills has passed a House committee, but the rest are still kind of stalled out. And lastly, at the state level, West Virginia has a couple bills that, again, like Hawaii and Maryland, are looking at similar concepts and similar restrictions as California and Connecticut. Turning to the federal level, where Congress seems paralyzed on being able to do really anything these days. This might be the one area that they actually get something done. So there is a bill proposed in the Senate called the Children and Teens Online Privacy Protection Act. This one's being referred to colloquially as COPPA 2.0. It would require teens, so teens themselves could consent before the collection, use, and disclosure of their personal information. So it's creating a consent concept similar to what exists for children under 13, where the parent has to give consent, but the teen themselves could do that. It also provides certain other privacy protections for teens that are really targeted specifically to that age group, which it defines as 13 to 16-year-olds. This one has bipartisan co-sponsors, including some committee chairs. So it's a bill that may have some legs to it. But the one that seems to have the most momentum behind it is this one called the Kids Online Safety Act. This is, oh, and I apologize, there's a typo. Senator Blackburn's a Republican from Tennessee. Hopefully she doesn't take offense there. This bill also has bipartisan co-sponsors. In fact, it has 62 out of 100 senators co-sponsoring this bill. So there definitely seems to be momentum for this one. It defines a child as someone under 13 and a minor as someone under 17. So it introduces two different definitions. And what you'll see as I talk about this one is a lot of the rules relate to minors, some relate to children. So it's really expanding some of these ideas that we see in California and Connecticut, but bringing them in at the federal level. It only applies to a covered platform. And this is where I think for a lot of businesses, they may be able to escape having to come under COSA, which is an online platform, online video game, messaging application, or video streaming service that's likely to be used by a minor. Online platform, if you really look at it, is kind of like a social media. It's kind of the concept of like a social media service or something where people come together. An online video game isn't just an online video game. In order to be covered, it has to be one where the user can create and upload content or engage in microtransactions or communicate with other users, or that has targeted advertising to minors. So depending on how the video game is structured, it might not actually meet the definition of an online video game. Messaging application and video streaming service are not defined. So those are going to have sort of probably their plain concept. So like a Netflix is almost certainly a video streaming service. A WhatsApp is almost certainly a messaging application, right? Those are just going to be their normal concepts. COSA has a number of requirements. The first of which is this duty of care concept, right? Which we see coming out of California and Connecticut, that you've got to think about how you prevent harm to minors. It also requires easy to use safeguards to limit communication. They're really concerned, it seems, about minors receiving inappropriate content or hate speech or things like that that can contribute to mental health issues for minors. So easy to use ways to cut down on those communications when they're not wanted, to be able to delete your data, to, if you want to impose a time restriction, I don't want to be on Instagram more than 30 minutes in a day, being able to set something like that. And also being able to limit personalized recommendations. This is an area that we've seen a lot of discussion in Congress and committee hearings where they're concerned about how the algorithms feed content to users. And so being able to set some rules around that. Like in California, those privacy settings would have to be at their strictest by default for minors. And then the minor can back them down as they want to. But importantly, it would also give tools for parents to control purchases, to control personal data collection and use, and also to be able to report harms. So when they see something occurring in the online platform, to be able to report that so the business can take action. Beyond that, it also prohibits dark patterns. Dark patterns are patterns in design, the way you construct something that pushes a user towards a certain choice, typically the more expensive or the least privacy protective choice. So no dark patterns. These types of platforms could not have advertising to minors for things that minors probably shouldn't be buying. They would have to have detailed privacy notices, terms and conditions, even labels on ads that give information about how those ads are being served, how other content is coming to them, the safeguards available, the parental tools, what things could cause a heightened risk of harm. Very, very detailed disclosure requirements. If you're a large platform, so 10 million or more monthly active users, you would even have public reporting and independent third-party audit requirements. So I mean, they're really taking this seriously for the bigger players in this space. This law would be in effect 18 months after it passes and is signed, and the FTC has full jurisdiction to enforce it. A violation would be considered an unfair or deceptive act or practice under the FTC's authorizing statute. And certain provisions could actually be enforced by state AGs, which is not an unheard of concept. The telemarketing sales rule has similar similar provisions. So you could see not only federal enforcement, but state enforcement as well. And one of the interesting things is there was another bill called the Filter Bubble Transparency Act, or Act-ish is how I'm referring to it. It originally was its own bill. It's now part of COSA. And this bill is trying to target how algorithms serve us information and content in a way that we can't understand. And they refer to those as opaque algorithms. So if you have an online platform, so remember the definition of an online platform from COSA, that uses an opaque algorithm, there would now be additional notice and terms requirements about that algorithm, how it works, what data is going into it, and you would have to have certain options for how you could opt out of it or modify the way it functions. And the bill would actually prohibit differential pricing based on if you decide, you know what, I don't want an opaque algorithm serving me something. I want an input transparent algorithm, which has a certain definition. But it's essentially saying, if you make a privacy focused choice of how you want the algorithm to work, you shouldn't have to pay more because you want to protect your privacy. If this passed as part of COSA, it would actually be in effect 1 year instead of 18 months after the law is enacted. And what's kind of interesting here is they did not give state AGs enforcement authority on this component. Only the FTC has it. And so if you have developed an online platform that uses opaque algorithms, definitely something to pay close attention to. So we'll see if Congress can get something out the door. My money is on, if anything makes it through, it'll be COSA, but I'm also not the person you should take to a casino. So we'll see what happens. So I'd like to turn to the other question that we received before the session. If you have questions that you'd like us to address, please do put those in the Q&A box, and we'll tackle them here at the end. This question relates, and Aaron, I'm going to toss this to you. This question relates to whether or how a website operator can ever know if a user is under 13, especially when there are different standards or protections like Apple Screen Time that can be bypassed by kids. And I think certainly myself and I would imagine most people on today's webinar, when we were under 13, we probably told some website that we were older than 13, right? So how do you deal with that?
Right, yeah. So age gating is a good start, but as you mentioned, it's not the most foolproof. A child could easily lie about their age in order to get past that. So you have to begin to look to other factors. Are you collecting their age in a natural prompt on the website? Could that be a good indicator of age? Are you reviewing the content that they're viewing? Or do you know that the content that you're posting would be in the interest of a child versus somebody that would be above the age of 18? Are you reviewing posts? Have you seen whether or not they're posting online about something that would be able to recognize them as a child? So we really have to go to other factors here to start determining whether what age the child is beyond just an age gate where they answer, are you older than 13 or something like that. As I mentioned, there are AI technologies that will help to combine information to make this determination.
Yeah, it's going to be a struggle. I mean, and I don't think there's any foolproof way to do it. What the regulators are going to look at is, did you use reasonable means, right? Did you look at the data you're collecting, your specific website, how you interact with the public, and using the different components that Aaron mentioned, come up with a reasonable strategy for how you would estimate that age. That's really what they're looking for. And as we tell clients all the time, it's about the defendable position in a lot of these sorts of things, because there's just not often a 100% solid foolproof system. All right. Well, with that, I don't see any other questions. If you think of something afterwards, our contact information is on the screen. And again, if you would like other blogs or content, please do visit our website. There is a whole host of past blogs, past webinars that are available on there that you can check out, a lot on privacy. And I would just like to say, on behalf of myself and Aaron, thank you so much for joining us, and hopefully we'll see you on another webinar soon. Have a great day.